You probably did.
Thank you so much for the invitation and introduction. As you can see, there is a motto to my speech today. Okay. There is a motto to my presentation that comes from Frankie's archives in Poland. Is it still? Okay. So this is just a little annotation from the Frankist archive in Poland. On the day, the 3rd of August, 1657, the four of us heard a ground voice clamoring from heaven. Haim, Haim. In my presentation, I want to sketch a portrait of Gershom Scholem as a secret Marrano, deeply interested in Marrano theology as a still living formula of Jewish revelation, which he, in the famous letter to Benjamin from 1935, described as Geltung ohne Bedeutung, a validity without content. I will attempt to show that the Marrano crisis of tradition constitutes a themaregion of Scholem's whole intellectual career, from his earliest diaries, Lamentations of Youth, through his own theological declarations, 10 unhistorical aphorisms on Kabbalah, up to his latest essays and interviews gathered under the characteristic title, Jews and Judaism in Crisis. In my interpretation, Scholem the Marrano hides behind the mask of the Jewish historian, but the secret kernel of his doctrine is not historical. His continuous insistence on the ongoing vitality of the hidden truth of the tradition, das Wahre, as opposed to the overt articulation of the traditional religious form of life, Tradierbarkeit, reveals a strong theological agenda that governs the works of Scholem the historian from within. In result of Scholem's not purely historical approach to the Marrano theology, the Marrano crisis of tradition, seemingly an affair of the past, comes to the fore as a still actual phenomenon and raises the issue of the hidden faith as the sole authentic form of Judaic religiosity, which not only does not betray Jewish tradition, but paradoxically touches on its very core. According to Abraham Miguel Cardozo, the Marrano theologian of the Sabbatarian movement, and in David Bialik's opinion, young Scholem begins working on Sabbatarianism in 1927 when he finds in the Oxford Library precisely a manuscript of Cardozo's authorship. So according to Cardozo, the true faith can only be hidden. And Scholem repeats this esoteric truth a few centuries later in 1958, 10 unhistorical theses or aphorisms on Kabbalah, with the same powerful conviction: the authentic tradition remains hidden. Scholem expresses the Marrano intuition that the spectral truth of the tradition may lie deeper and even at odds with the chain of the tradition, transmitted from generation to generation through the overt teaching, by playing on the ambivalence of the Latin verb tradere, meaning to pass on, but also to betray, and thus insisting on the difference between tradition in its truth and Tradierbarkeit as that which can be transmitted, or Tradendum. Der Kabbalist behauptet, es gebe eine Tradition über die Wahrheit, die tradierbar sei. Eine ironische Behauptung, da ja die Wahrheit, um die es hier geht, alles andere ist als tradierbar. Sie kann erkannt werden, aber nicht überliefert werden. Und gerade das in ihr, was überlieferbar wird, enthält sie nicht mehr. Echte Tradition bleibt verborgen. Erst die verfallende Tradition verfällt auf einen Gegenstand und wird im Verfall erst in ihrer Größe sichtbar. The Kabbalist claims that there is a tradition of truth which can be handed over. This is a very ironic claim, since the truth of which it speaks is anything but capable of being handed over, tradierbar. The truth can become known, but not passed on. For precisely what can be passed on, the truth is no longer. The authentic tradition remains hidden. The falling tradition stumbles upon an object and shows its greatness only in the fact that it falls. This is not as heterodox as it might seem by notation. The potential contrast between the tradition as transmissibility and the tradition as the hidden truth comes to the fore already in the opening sentence of Pirkei Avot, the wisdom of the founding fathers of Talmud. Moses received the Torah from Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua transmitted it to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets transmitted it to the men of the great assembly. They said three things: be deliberate in judgment, raise many students, and make a protective fence for the Torah. Scholem makes this contrast explicit by charging the chain of tradition, conceived here as transmissibility, with the role of building a shell that would guard the kernel, as the svara of the tradition, and simultaneously guard its disciples from the overexposure to the hidden truth. The truth can become known but not passed on, because it cannot be communicated. The revelation establishes a unique, each time singular relation between the radical divine transcendence and the equally radical inwardness of the self, which mirrors the former in a sort of a concave Scholem likeness, and as such cannot be translated into the horizontal message handed over by the chain of tradition, Shalshalet HaKabbalah, in which every singular Scholem becomes merely a ring sustaining the strength of cultural identity. Yet at the same time, one cannot rest forever in this eternal elsewhere of the revelatory relation which bypasses the world and endangers the self with mystical annihilation. Even if Tradierbarkeit distorts the singular truth, one is not allowed to desist from the dialectical work of lessening the betrayal, nonetheless always present in the very act of trader. The truth is most precious, but it is also most dangerous. This is a necessary double bind of every authentic tradition. The tradition shows its greatness precisely when it falls, that is, reveals its inner aporia. It stumbles upon the object, which is the hidden truth, and in this manner shows that it exists precisely as limping, Jacob's way, hindered by the Kabbalistic antinomian kernel that cannot be fully assimilated by the shell of the teaching, or tradendum. The word object as Gegenstand, seemingly strange in the context of the mystical singular encounter between the unique Echad and its equally unique Scholem, is in fact well chosen. The Scholemian object stands here for the mysterious inhabitant of the crypt, which Nicholas Abraham and Maria Turek, the psychoanalyst Jewish-Hungarian couple, also using the Zoharic metaphor of the shell and the kernel, will soon discover as the cause of the condition called by them cryptophoria, the secret spark surrounded by the shards of the worldly discourse, which can never capture the elusive thing. The resisting counter-object, Gegenstand, as the thing, is thus carried by the tradition, which inevitably betrays its object on which it discursively focuses. The radiant excess of the real, what Scholem calls the strenge Licht des Kanonischen, which emanates from the crypt, inevitably evades all failing attempts to represent it symbolically. Thus, already Judaism is cryptophoric, and Marranismo, the condition of the doubly hidden truth, even more so. But if the authentic tradition must remain hidden, then the only way to keep it that way is silence. Not any uncharacteristic silence, as Harold Bloom perceptively notices in his essay on the Scholem non-historian, but a very specific one, which has only one equivalent precursor, the Marrano silencio. Scholem's silence is indeed anything but uncharacteristic. For him, it is a via negativa through which tradition must pass in order to renew itself. The silence, which points to the hidden truth, designates a crisis in the Herderlinian antinomian understanding of the term, that is, the point of risky intersection between das Gefährlichste, the highest danger, and das Rettende, in which the tradition falls by approaching the distraction in the total oblivion, but also the chance of salvation when it rises again as a phoenix from the ashes. What Scholem calls a fine line between religion and nihilism. Scholem, himself a product of a purgatory assimilation and secularization, as Mendes Floor described him, via his highly characteristic Hebrew silence, attempts to purge and thus renew the tradition by putting it to the same ordeal. He will try to find the hidden truth which resists the transmission chain of what can be handed over in the near-death experience of the disappearing tradendum of traditional Judaism. For if the relation between the truth and the transmission is as aporetic as he suggests in his Kabbalistic thesis, then the sickening of the tradition conceived as Tradierbarkeit, which was Benjamin's term defining the word of Franz Kafka, the prosa of Franz Kafka, but they used it with Scholem to describe the situation of Judaism in the 30s. So that the sickening of the tradition conceived as Tradierbarkeit, transmissibility, makes it possible to reveal what cannot be passed on, but what this tradition still contains or carries as its non-transmittable kernel. But already in his diaries from 1918, when he is only 21, Scholem obliquely refers to the Marrano experience, in which he himself participates as a member of the half-assimilated, tormented jury. While sketching an imaginary portrait of an ideal adept of the Jewish tradition as the one who could be silent in Hebrew, der auf Hebräisch schweigen kann, he writes, Hebrew must be the superlative of the teaching's silence. The person able to be silent in Hebrew surely partakes in the quiet life of youth. There is no one among us who can do this. We cannot use our existence as an argument precisely because silence, or more accurately, stillness, the Stille, is the step in which a life can become an argument. If one were to interpret this fragment as a Marrano allusion, the silence and the stillness would address the famous silencio of the Iberian conversos, which designates the Marrano secret, but also an Amidah, a silent prayer preserved and transformed in the new Christian context as being silent in Hebrew, that contemplates the divine mysteries without mediation of treacherous words, precisely as in the case of the Marrano mystics, John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, the Carmelite mystics, so well described by Michel de Certeau in La Fable Mystique. This heavy, eloquent silence wandered also into the teachings of the Polish Frankists, who spoke about the burden of silence, mas duma. But what makes Scholem's remark truly intriguing is the link between silencio and life, a mysterious connection in which life can become an argument. This line is a polemical crypto-quote from Nietzsche's Gay Science, where he says, this is the whole quote, that lies should be necessary to life is part and parcel of the terrible and questionable character of life. Life is no argument. According to Nietzsche, the fact that we live and want to live on, does not magically transform all the lies we applied to make the world livable into a truth. But really, doesn't it? On Scholem's account, the Zionist youngster, as the perfect adept of Judaism, should be able to do precisely that. Turn life into an argument which would speak for the verification of all the ruses used by life in order to secure a further survival. Life made into argument would thus be a positive result of an implication which has a power to verify, literally make true, even the falsest of premises. Whatever cunning, evasion, ruse life resorts to would become true if it results in the blessing of all life. Would it be far-fetched to treat it as an oblique hint to the Marrano condition of someone forced to lie, perjure, and betray in order to survive? Perhaps not at all. Perhaps young Scholem, who very early on senses the affinity between the 17th century converso experience of the Iberian Peninsula and the 19th century assimilation of German Jewry, secretly identifies with the metaphorical Marrano. He lives, he survived, he has broken with the tradition which he preserves only in silencio, being silent in Hebrew, yet he refuses to feel guilty and tormented about it, even if he also immediately admits that no one he knows is actually capable of such a daring act of liberation. In his dream, his Marrano reverie, as later on Derrida will call it, his life becomes an argument, and this step inaugurates an inversion. From the tragic predicament of the victims of coercion to the messianic hope of the rejected stones, promising a radical and innovative reversal of the perspective. Perhaps Scholem suggests here that the Marranos, for whom life as such indeed became a serious argument, broke with the over tradition in order to survive, yet did not break with the truth of the tradition and its promise of more life, which can only stay hidden, verboten, and thus kept in silence. Life can become an argument chimes here with the divine imperative, Uvaharta Bahaim, choose life, or choose to live. The only open articulation that alludes to the secret truth and trumps every choice of death, including the glorious martyrological death, as an expression of faithfulness to the tradition. Silencio, therefore, marks the break with tradition as Tradierbarkeit, transmissibility, that keeps faithful to the tradition as its hidden truth, Wahrheit. Marranos, choosing to live on, merely broke free from the chain of tradition, unfettered themselves from the obligation to transmit the teaching overtly, but did not break with the secret core of this teaching, which they continue in the superlative of the teaching's silence. Against Nietzsche's debunking of life as a web of lies, Scholem would thus claim that the authentic hidden Jewish tradition chooses life as the strongest possible argument, stronger than death, either inflicted or honorable. Life as survival, finding expression in the Hebräisches Schweigen, a silent prayer worshipping God in the desert of exile, would be the secret treasure as well as the kernel of Judaism as a messianic revelation. And yet Scholem insists that there is no one among us who can do this. The sense of guilt prevails, as it indeed was the case with most of the Spanish Marranos, and with it the metaphysics of tragedy, in which all life is made a priori guilty, as Walter Benjamin will soon reveal in his critique of violence, thus preventing life from becoming an argument and enabling a messianic Marrano inversion. Survival, the quiet life of the youth, which takes life for granted and does not feel guilty about being alive, this most despised, rejected stone should and can, according to Scholem, become a foundation of the tradition once again renewed in the repeated revelation of its hidden truth. In the background of Scholem's remarks on the quiet life of youth, there also lurks Walter Benjamin's life of the students. The essay published in 1915, to which Benjamin's younger colleague adds a theological gloss. Benjamin too intends to turn life into an argument in a manner that would allow the bright young ones to follow their vitalistic instinct without falling into the snares of the fascist Wandervögel, all too eager to capture and economize the youth's energy. Composed in 1914 and published in Die Neue Merkur in 1915, when Benjamin was still a president of the radical group called Freie Studentenschaft, this essay contains in the nutshell the antinomian doctrine of life, which rebels against repression and distortion, and presses towards the future when it will be able to emerge in an undistorted form at last. According to the antinomian logic, however, this undistorted form appears here and now in the condition of life distortion assumed as a norm, as twisted and perverse, as the most endangered, excoriated, and ridiculed ideas and products of the creative mind. Only a youth can carry such laughable doctrine and eventually succeed in liberating the future from the deformed existence in the womb of the present. In his 1918 entry, Scholem extrapolates the issues raised by Benjamin on the life of the Zionist youth when confronted with the second Jewish tradition. And here came Benjamin. There is a very simple and reliable criterion by which to test the spiritual value of a community. It is to ask, does it allow all of individuals' efforts to be expressed? Is the whole human being committed to it and indispensable to it? For Benjamin, life is a total commitment or nothing at all. But within the university, for Scholem, within tradition, the most important thing of all, the life that would be willing to dedicate itself to reconstruction, is excluded. His goal, therefore, is to enable the German students to step forward as the champions of life at its best, where this life at its best is also a life more deeply conceived, including the creative life of the mind, setting itself wholeheartedly to the task of reconstruction and regeneration. The life of the students either serves the goal of a total renewal of the teaching, learning, and the tradition for the sake of life, or gets completely wasted and then dies in the vocational training, or what Scholem later on will call in one of his letters to Salma Schocken a professorial death. They are taught in their professor. Obviously something we know very well. But why do I insist on Scholem's significance in recapturing the Marrano experience in its late modern metaphorical form? Because already in his diaries, the Marranos represents the most intimate, or rather, in Lacanian terminology, extimate truth of the diasporic Jew. The Marrano experience is the one of a bare life, forever exiled from the Lebensform of traditional Judaism, and left hanging in the symbolic vacuum, waiting for a new tradition to come. The experience of Galut at its absolute extreme as simultaneously the greatest danger and the chance of salvation, as Genesium, the healing of the sickened Tradierbarkeit, Tradenda. Now, in 1918, the Marrano is still nothing but a distorted seed of a future possibility contained in the womb of the present in the form of the most endangered, excoriated, and ridiculed idea, which no one among us yet dares to turn into a serious argument. But one of the tasks Scholem sets to himself while committing his life fully to it is precisely this daring denouement. Just as the Spanish Marranos refused to die for the sake of the Jewish tradition and chose to leave, even in exile, from Judaism, so does young Scholem refuse to die in the adherence to the sickened Judaism, as he knows it in its present form, and chooses to leave, even at the risk of turning the whole tradition on its head, in which he in fact succeeded, by giving us a new vision of Judaism from the perspective of the Marrano. the one who breaks with the chain of the tradition and then returns to it on his own terms, inserting his own crisis into the middle of the tradition, no longer to be perceived as an unbreakable chain. In his later elaboration, Galut indeed becomes a cosmic universal condition of all things subsisting in exile, God included. Already in the 40s, Scholem begins to think of Tzimtzum as symbol of a radical break, cut, and because of that, as an emblem of exilic being, a single ring separated from the chain. He says, one is tempted to interpret this withdrawal of God into his own being in terms of exile, of banishing himself from his totality into profound seclusion. Regarded this way, the idea of Tzimtzum is the deepest symbol of exile that could be thought of. And when presenting the series of catastrophes that before creation from the foundational act of Tzimtzum, Scholem describes the breaking of the vessels as the moment of disintegration of the Neoplatonic chain of emanations, due to which the condition of exile afflicts all beings. I won't read the quote, just to continue. But who would incarnate better this subsistence in Galut, the precarious, fragile, disoriented mode of being of the broken universe, better than the Marrano? Is not the Marrano a broken vessel himself? If God indeed wanted his people to go and worship him in the desert, one cannot think about the desert harsher than the one of the Marrano exile, something that Yirmiyahu Yovel calls a triple exile. According to Yirmiyahu Yovel, the Marrano exilic experience should be taken to the third power. Consequently, they, the conversos, lived a triple exile. As purported Jews, they were exiled from Zion. As conversos, they were cut off from the mainstream of Jewish life. And as Judaizers, they lived in exile from their host society. The Lacanian term, the extimate truth, is very fitting here because it refers to the secret core of the psyche, which the subject cannot fully integrate during the process of its symbolic formation. In result, the most intimate part becomes rejected as a part maudite, cursed and projected outside. The Marranos are precisely such homini sacri of Jewish tradition, the cursed part of Judaism, but precisely as the extimate projection of the most intimate Wahrheit der Tradition, almost the ecce homo of Jewishness, as the truth, almost impossible to bear and witness, from which the whole Tradierbarkeit, tradition as transmissibility, reverts in an apotropaic gesture. Like destitute Oedipus in Colonna for the Greeks, like Jesus suffering on the cross for the Christians, and like the Musulman, the Agamemnian embodiment of bare life for the inhabitants of late modernity, so is Marrano for the Jews, a moment of terrifying recognition of an exilic fate common to them all. So, if the followers of Abraham Cardozo would claim that all Jews should become Marranos, it is because all Jews already are Marranos in the depth of the unconscious. The eternal outsiders, constantly being alienated also from the womb of their own tradition as the chain of the over Tradierbarkeit, a universal remnant. They are always already expelled from every womb in the ceaseless Lekha, from the paradise, from the land of origin, from the sacred places, even from their God. The Marrano condition merely reveals the impossibility of ever returning to and refinding the lost home. By exacerbating the universal exile of homelessness, it shows the Jewish truth in its absolute and uncanny nakedness. Precisely as in Maurice Blanchot, the great Jewish sage, Blanchot's description of Judaism's nocturnal hidden truth. The Hebrew himself will not remain Hebrew. The relation through migration and march with the unknown that one can know only by way of distance becomes, with the filing out of Jabok, and in the night of Penuel, enigmatic contact. The struggle about which one knows nothing, since what is at stake is the truth of the night, that which is not to be retained when day breaks. Perhaps also this je ne sais quoi that Yankelevich mentions in case of the Hebrew non-identity. So it is in the Hebrew's nature not to have nature. It belongs to the Hebrew's identity not to have identity. It is according to the Hebrew's tradition to go against tradition. It pertains to the Hebrew's mode of fidelity to betray and live in a constant crisis. It is part of the Hebrew's life to choose life, even at the expense of all stable forms of life. The spectral, intangible unknown, whom the Hebrew worships in the desert of the night, destabilizes any attempt to reach secure identity. Whatever the law of the day puts in order, the law of the night unbinds and turns infinitely enigmatic, liquid, unnameable. Jacob, portrayed by Blanchot, also by Harold Bloom, is a notorious trickster and a restless wanderer, crossing every possible Penuel and every possible Rubicon in order to realize the blessing of more life. Any frontier of natural belonging, refusing to take place among natural kinds, which all know their right measure and place under the sun. And while wrestling with the divine angel, Jacob also wrestles with the tradition itself. As such, he can also join the pantheon of the Marrano saints, together with Joseph and Esther. Scholem's entry suggests that if there indeed were among us a young hero akin to Jacob, that is, able to look this negativity which the Marrano condition represents straight into its Gorgon eye, the tradition would have rediscovered its hidden truth and come out of this aeon rejuvenated. For the Nietzschean sentence, what does not kill you makes you stronger, applies not only to the subject, but to the tradition too. Nietzsche's agonistic wisdom pervades this little fragment, even if partly polemically. The youth challenges to the agon the Benjaminian old and wizened dwarf of theology, represented by the Kafkan elders from the castle, while life confronts the angel of Tradierbarkeit in silence and stillness, insisting on itself as the most valid, hidden argument. I saw God face to face, fought him, and prevailed, says Jacob, and young Scholem hopes he will be the one to say it again, to recollect forward the distant antinomian origin of Jewish faith. His Marrano moment locates him, indeed, in the Herderlinian point of the greatest danger of the complete collapse of Judaism, Ostravendum, and the hope of salvation in the risky renewal of its hidden truth. And just conclusion. So, for Scholem, the Marrano crisis is inscribed in the very essence of the Judaic tradition, as always, already sickened and falling, that is, failing to live up, literally, as the chain of transmission to the hidden truth of revelation, as the blessing of new life, which destabilizes every tradition by staking on the imperative of choose to live as always excessive towards any symbolic form, and because of that capable to manifest itself only in silence, either the Marrano silencia of those who chose to survive, or in the quiet life of youth of those who chose not to die together with the second tradition. This permanent agonistic crisis cannot ever be overcome. It should be recognized, says Scholem, and acknowledged as what gives the Jewish tradition its dialectical intensity. The Judaism, which Scholem wishes to renew as a Marrano relapse, determined to drag his own experience of the crisis into the midst of the Judaic tradition, can never regain a harmonious integrity of a religious Lebensform, a form of life. If Judaism is to be a living tradition, open to innovation and renewal, it must constantly go through and survive the crisis caused by the clash between the two apoplectic elements that constitute it: the kernel of the hidden truth on the one hand, and the chain of transmission on the other.